Hi. Okay. All right. So, what is your name?
My name is Richard James.
Did you ever have a nickname as a child?
Yes, in fact, I was called Ricky.
Okay. When did you stop being called Ricky, or what happened with the name to go to Richard?
I think all throughout high school, with people that were very familiar with me, I stayed Ricky.
Okay.
And then once I went to college, it became Richard. Just because when I
Why?
introduced myself at college, it was, oh, my name is Richard. And people didn't say, oh, what do we call you, Ricky? You know what I mean? So it just happened naturally at that point.
Okay. So it was just a natural
progression.
evolution. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So what
I'm
year-
not very particular about what people call me.
Okay.
You know how some people are very fussy about that?
Right.
So if some people call me one thing or the other, it's fine for me.
You're comfortable either way.
Yeah. And some people, like neighbors, call me Rick.
How do you feel about that?
That's fine. One neighbor, in fact, called me Chris. I didn't feel like correcting him. So for years, I was Chris.
So you just ran with that.
Ran with it.
Did he ever find out that wasn't your name?
Another neighbor, like 2 or 3 years later, filled him in on it, which pissed me off. So he said, what is your name? Is it Chris or Rick? And I said, well, Chris is my middle name, and I like it better, so sometimes I go by Chris.
Are you serious? Why did you do that? To save him?
Oh, what a web we weave when first we practice to deceive. I felt like I got caught up in this web.
That's hysterical. Okay. All right. What year were you born, Chris?
Okay, I was born in 1956.
Okay. Who was president the year you were born?
Eisenhower, Dwight D. Eisenhower.
Okay.
Not that I ever was conscious of that, you know.
Right, but looking back.
By the time
in
I
your
was
childhood-
conscious, Kennedy was president.
Okay.
But anyway,
Where did you grow up predominantly?
as a small child, I grew up on Long Island in Queens, and, in that general area. And then when I was 10, our family moved to a town called Deer Park on Long Island. And that's really, in my mind, the home I think of as my childhood home.
Why?
Because I was more conscious. I was, from 10 to 17, are very significant years in your childhood. And it was the kind of place, it was an interesting house, and it was an interesting neighborhood with lots of children. And so it was just the type of place that when someone says, what's your childhood home like, that's the place I immediately think of.
So you don't think of the earlier places that you lived on?
I can easily remember 2 of the earlier places. But, if someone would say your childhood home, I would immediately think Deer Park.
Mm-hmm. What did you like about Deer Park more than the other places you lived as a child?
I think, like I said, the years I was living there,
Okay.
I was much more conscious. Plus also the fact that there were so many kids around. And for some reason, I don't know if it was a neighborhood culture or if your older brother had something to do with this, but a lot of kids, we used to play like in gangs. Like we'd have play activities involving like 30 kids, 20 to 30 kids. And that's a lot of fun when you're a kid,
Yeah.
Especially a young kid.
And he was sort of like the Pied Piper in
Yes,
a way.
and, and he would organize.
All right. Tell me about your parents. Describe your parents.
My parents were very young when they met and young when they married, and they grew up in Brooklyn, opposite sides of the same street. I like to joke that my mother was Jewish and my father Italian, and Jews and Italians are the same, just different sides of the street.
That's a good way to put it.
And like I said, they married very young and started having a lot of kids. And they were very interesting people. My father was very athletic and intelligent and cerebral. And my mother was, to my mind at least, was poetic and dramatic. And when I was very little, magical, like that. And they were very interesting parents to have.
In what way was she magical?
There was always like some poetry about her, like the way she moved, the way she spoke, the way she was always contemplative. When I was a little kid. She changed later on as I got older. My impression of her changed, let's say, more even than perhaps she changed. But she was very artistic, and like her sensibility about like where to put things, what colors and costumes, and the positioning of things, and everything She reminds me of like a lot of people I met later in life as an adult, a lot of Japanese people. They're conscious of everything visual, and that's the way my mother was. You know, whether or not the picture was hanging 2 inches too high on the wall or something, you know, she did.
What's your birth order?
I'm the middle of 5 kids, well, actually, and then I have 2 half-siblings, so I'm the third of 7. So, it's a lot of kids. I think that was sort of important too, the fact that I was a middle kid, and I'm a typical middle child.
In what way?
At least in terms of my sibling group, I'm what I considered as a child easy to get along with, humorous, artistic, flexible.
You think you're easy to get along with and flexible because you were the middle child?
Yes, I think that had something to do with it, for sure. As a kid, I sort of had to learn from an early age how to accommodate people that were in my group, but just a little bit older than me, and only make a squawk about things that were meaningful, and don't sweat the small stuff. So, my older sister was liked to be in charge of things. So on everything that didn't really matter, I would allow her to be in charge of, and only be firm about the things that matter, that kind of thing.
Some people might say that's a really useful quality.
I think it is a useful quality. Anyway, I do think that was important, the birth order. I think that was a significant thing in my life.
How would you have described you as a child? And that you might have just covered that in a way.
Quirky. And on top of that, quirky, and I would have to say original. The way I thought, what I thought about, what I was interested in. I think other people recognized it, not always in a positive. They didn't think of it as a positive.
Meaning, like teachers, who didn't think of it as a positive?
Teachers, they felt I was a little too sure of my own thoughts. Do you know what I mean? And I wasn't just as receptive to their propaganda as they would prefer. I had an agenda, especially an artistic agenda, very early on because I was a childhood insomniac. So I would stay up to, until the TV went when the TV stations went off, almost every night.
From when were you an insomniac? What age?
7 to 8.
Why?
Not insomniac and I can't sleep and be stressed about it.
Okay.
It's just that I would wake up at all hours,
okay.
And I would flick on the TV. And children have very good hearing, so I could listen to the TV really low and But I have to stress that it wasn't a negative thing. I didn't feel strung out. I just felt secret time for me. And old movies. So by the time I was 5, 6, I was obsessed with old movies. By the time I was 7 and 8. I could name hundreds and hundreds of old actors from the 30s and the 40s.
From this insomnia behavior, you used that time
to sort of
absorb information.
Yeah, to catalog a lot of information.
Catalog.
A lot.
Do you think there might be a reason that you woke up because it was hard to have control of the TV in those days?
I think it was a positive experience, and then and that sort of just reinforced the behavior.
Okay.
So by the time I branched out from just television to, in the old days, you had these crappy transistor radios or plug-in radios, really crappy for reception. But also I discovered it around 11, 12, 13-ish. In the middle of the night, weird music was on. It was sophisticated, folky, rocky music. You know what I mean? So you would only hear that kind of stuff at 2, 3 in the morning. And then I got very excited about that.
So that may have sort of reinforced that sense of originality because you were getting information that wasn't typical, that wasn't the mainstream.
That my age and friend cohort, that wasn't part of their normal lexicon, whatever, their normal encyclopedia of knowledge. Mine was the same but a little bit different. Same categories, but I had a little different input. And
I'm sorry, I just want to make sure it's on because yes, it is, and I'm sorry. had to go and ruin Perfect Stream by doing that. But I had Dylan's voice in my head. Make sure you check it's running. And I forgot to check.
People generally like talking about themselves. It's easy. Do you agree?
I think that's the point, but I don't think people are given permission to do so.
I know. That's why this is such an enjoyable, situation for me.
And I'm nosy, so it works for me. So it's a win-win.
I wouldn't say nosy. You're fascinated with the way their mind works.
I like the backstories.
Yeah.
That's what's driving me here.
That's a good
I
way
like
to
the
put
backstories.
things.
Yeah. What was your earliest? I know you've told me this, but what was your earliest memory?
Very clear, and I've never changed it, so everyone can know it's accurate. I think I was 2 to 2.5, which is earlier than most people remember things. And I was upset with my parents, about something. Like they said no about something. Who knows? I have no idea what it is. Threw myself down on our family dog, which was a large black German Shepherd named Wolf. And I cried on him, and he felt so good because he just turned and looked at me and was all cuddly, And it was just, at that point, I fell in love with dogs.
The kind parental figure, Wolf, who was also a parental figure for me later, and that's another story.
Was he?
Remember when Aunt Muriel babysat for me? And
that was a great story.
Okay.
He wouldn't let her near the crib when you were crying because he wanted to protect you. In every place we lived, there's a different color palette for the lighting. Excuse me. Crispin, come over here and look. There's a different color palette for the lighting. Like in Massachusetts, there was no yellow. It was all blue and red. And in Queens, it was more like the color I think of as turquoise. And on Long Island,
that's insane because I would have said the same
thing.
So why is that? Maybe it has something to do with the house.
Something to do with our immediate environment.
Okay, go ahead.
And Deer Park was more of a rounded palette, but there was a lot of green.
A lot of green. I was just going to say green.
Isn't it crazy? Well, we shared a childhood, so.
So, I didn't know other people had associated memories with colors.
I'm a little bit light on the smell memory. For some reason, I have no problem with smelling. I have a good sense of smell. But it's not like a trigger for a gazillion memories, although some, like certain perfumes, etc. But, and food, very little, memory. I have food stories that I laugh at.
Yeah. Well, I had a friend once who always, she remembered everything associated with food, what she ate. If you asked her about a date, she'll always remember what she ate there. She was very skinny, too.
So it has nothing to do with overeating.
I don't know. Nothing to do with that. What were you good at as a child?
I was very good at the kind of physical skill like gymnasts would have, but I never thought to say, I should be in a gymnast program. I could do things like stand on my hands and jump through hold one of my legs and jump through it. And so unusually good in those types of things, coordinated things.
Okay.
And I was very fast as a little kid. My older brother, Michael, always would apply so much pressure because he was like a bloodhound. As soon as he sensed that you were good at something, he would encourage you. And his idea of encouraging was making you run races and timing you and writing scripts for how practices should be. And so that was so unpleasant to me because I felt like I was losing control of my own life, that I would always become no, I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
So I feel bad because he was always so kind about that, being interested and wanting to be helpful. But I swear because of that, I didn't pursue a lot of things.
And because of your personality, some other people might have thrived in that environment.
I only like to be in total control of my own destiny because I had a very clear idea about you shouldn't be bossing me around about that. You could boss me around about X, Y, and Z, but about that, I'm in control. Do you know what I mean? I felt that you had it when you were a younger child. You had to be that way, I think. Because a lot of you had parents and aunts and uncles and older siblings trying to control you.
Right.
Good.
That's all right. All right. So, what were you good at as a child? Was the question.
Okay. There were other things.
What else?
I felt I was good at drawing because both your parents, every time I would draw something, they would oh, so good. She'd frame that, you're an artist, you know. Almost to the point where I felt a little suspicious. Like, and I felt like, oh, I'm just your kid. But they would go overboard. And so it just convinced me at a very early age, I mean like 6 or 7, that I was really good at drawing. So by the time I was in the 3rd grade, I was convinced I was really good. And I remember copying a little postcard my great aunt had sent from Mexico of a little Mexican lady with a bowl on her head and her little kid walking behind her with a bowl on their head. And like I did a little painting. And the teacher at school didn't particularly like it. I think she was a racist, but that's just me. But I folded it up and I went home, and like I remember hanging up my jacket, and my mother pulled it out of my pocket and said, "You folded this? It's a masterpiece. It's wonderful. It's so beautiful." You know. And I remember being embarrassed, but then they had it framed.
Did your parents draw?
My mother was particularly good at drawing, and guess what? My father drew well too. And my father actually would sculpt little things out of clay. And he was particularly good. As kids, we didn't associate him with that, but both of our parents were like artistic, and he was very good at the sculpture. And my mother was good with the drawing and the painting. She had a very spare design type style of drawing. Like there was nothing extra. And your father was more like traditional and like emotional, and he was good. And as I got older, I realized that he was really good. He never took it seriously in terms of, it was just like a little bit of a hobby to him. Anyway, I remember an artist painted him many years later when he was playing chess, and she thought of herself as an artist. It was a terrible thing. But I remember thinking at the time when I saw that painting of him, he's significantly better than this artist who painted him.
That's what you thought?
Oh, that was the only thing I thought of when I saw that painting. And you're probably familiar with it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Everywhere.
It hung everywhere. It looked like it.
So what were your thoughts about your extended family in your childhood?
I was very close with my mother's 2 aunts that raised her when she was orphaned at 9. You know what I mean? And I liked them very much, and they were a combination of funny and fierce and very generous to us. And generous in the sense that they were very interested in us, and they behaved as if we were very important to them, which means something to a kid. And my father's parents, I really liked my grandfather, even though he could be a little annoying. But
what did you like about him?
He was very interesting to listen to, even from a very early age, very interesting to listen to. And nothing that he said was stupid. You know what I mean? It's like, you know how like you hear adults saying stuff and it's just like, shut up. It's like,
as a kid.
There's crap coming out of their mouth. Like, wah, wah, wah. Well, it wasn't like that with him. It was good. And my grandmother was very nice. And just recently I thought, oh my God, that woman could cook. I never thought about it because food was never a thing to me. But now thinking back on it, anything Italian that she made was unbelievably good. And I do remember on Sunday meals, we often would go to their house, like a couple of different families. Their adult children with their kids would come. And if you weren't fast, other people would eat everything. Anyway, I guess everyone feels that way about their grandmother, but I didn't feel that way growing up. It wasn't conscious to me, but just recently I thought about that. And she was a very hard worker, that woman. And she would tell me stories. I would try to get stories out of these people when I was a kid. That in her family there was a lot of lazy sisters. God forgive me if any of them are still alive.
And maybe watching this.
That's the thought. But she was the only one that worked really hard. But she was the one her mother depended on to do all the work. She was the second oldest. So she would do a lot of the housework, a lot of the cooking, a lot of the errands. And she was just always going. Anyway.
Do you remember the story of how your grandparents met?
This was a great story. I don't know how they actually met, but I do remember my grandfather was around 22-ish or something, in that age, 21, 22, and he met this family, and they had like 8 sisters. And it was time for him to get married, And they came from a good family, especially my grandmother's mother especially. No one liked her because she thought of herself as hoity-toity, but that was an attractive feature to my grandfather, that it was a classy family. And she was related to some people that were whatever back in Italy. Anyway, so my grandfather was excited that he had a selection of sisters, and he looked and he saw they were all really tall, and he was a short man. And there was one sister that was short, like his height, about his height. And he said to himself, ooh, I'll marry, so I could have a wife that isn't taller than me, but she'll throw kids. When she has kids, my sons will be tall.
How did you hear this story?
My grandfather told me
He
that.
told you.
My grandfather told me that story, and he wasn't ashamed of it. And it wasn't something that would have made my grandmother upset. She would have said, good thinking.
He didn't use the word throw good children.
No, he didn't use that word. He was thinking, oh, when I have children, my sons will be tall because they come from a tall family. And yet at the same time, I won't have the indignity of having a very tall wife compared to me. Anyway. And she was also very attractive. She was like 19, and he, and I think they had a long, happy marriage. Like, in other words, they were emotionally connected all those years. Many years later, when I was 10, so they were already many times grandparents, and they came to visit us at Deer Park, and we were sitting at an outdoor dining table. It was a concrete round table towards the front of our yard. So there must have only been around 8 people because it couldn't fit too many. And your grandfather kept saying, Mafalda, get that. Mafalda, I need more coffee. Mafalda. And she kept jumping up and jumping up. And then and she leaned over to me as she was passing once. And she said it as a joke, but I was 10, so she leaned over and she said, so if I ever take a life and kill your grandfather, you won't blame me. I remember later I told my mother, Grandma said she might stab Grandpa because he always pushes her around, and my mother said he deserves it. She obviously was joking.
But she wasn't aggressive to him, but
No,
I guess that was
she
a way
never,
of...
Yeah, she was indirect. But she was also funny.
But she acknowledged that he was annoying.
Yeah, and she said it in a funny way. So an adult would have laughed at that.
Right.
Because they would have said, me too, you have a lot of patience of a saint.
To me, she did seem to have the patience of a saint.
Yeah, because he would, without even thinking, he would boss her around for half an hour at a time. And she would just...
But he seemed very dedicated.
Oh, yeah. And I have a little great story about him as well, only through your father. My grandfather's son. And it was the last time I think I ever spoke at length with my father. And he was saying, you have to understand, when I was little, before the world and hardships got to your grandfather, he was a different person. He was much more liberal and open-minded and generous in spirit, and what today you would call progressive in politics. And he was a leader, and he was always looking to help people. And I remember once we were on vacation upstate New York somewhere, and one of the group of people that were there, the husband disappeared in a canoe, and the wife was distraught. And so a group of us, including my father, went out on a boat on the lake to look for her. And my grandfather, or my father was saying to me, my father turned to the wife, who was very upset and crying, we won't come back without him. We'll find him. And we sat there for hours and hours into the night, and finally, deep into the night, the canoe appears.
Oh.
And he said, that's the kind of man my father is. I get emotional.
What year was that? What do you think? Take a guess. What decade?
I would say 38.
Okay.
1938.
Ever as a child, did you ever wish you were someone else or something else?
I always wish I had magic powers. And there's a million things I wished I was. I wish I was a little taller, that kind of thing. But I didn't see another person say, I wish I was them instead of me. It was always very important. I wouldn't want to have their burdens. You know what I mean?
So what kind of magic powers did you think of?
Well, this is very common, but a lot of people dream of flying, and every time I had a flying dream, it was just so fantastic. I would wake up and for like half an hour think about, that would be so great. Like flying from tree branch to tree branch, that kind of thing. Gliding.
I wonder why people have those dreams. It's sort of universal.
I wonder why it is universal. So it's like maybe from evolution, who knows?
What do you feel was the biggest sacrifice you ever made in your life?
I don't think I made many sacrifices. I think people view certain things I did as sacrifices, and it's embarrassing for me to talk about because I don't view it that way. I viewed it as commitment. So let's skip that question.
Okay. And that eliminates the next question, too.
Okay.
Was there any incident that contributed to a change of direction of your life story?
Yeah, job situations, like losing jobs, maybe trying something new, with an opportunity to try something totally different. After college, my sister happened to live in Chicago, and so I went to Chicago right after college, and that was a lot of fun, and it was like, that wouldn't have happened if I wouldn't have gone there if it hadn't been that she was already there, and she was going for her master's in art or something in Chicago.
Do you think that contributed somehow to your personality evolution, living in another city? So,
yeah,
so
everything
different?
everything does, but there are many things that for the first time I became totally aware of about the way other people live. You know, because you're a young adult. You know, college is college. It's like an insulated environment. You know, it's more about young people, studying and having fun. But the people I came into contact with in Chicago were different classes of people, different races of people. It's the first time I ever worked with someone who was gay. There were a bunch of gay waiters at this restaurant, and they were unbelievably hilarious. So in my mind, it meant that gay people were hilarious. And it isn't true. When you go through a life and you meet other ones, they're not necessarily hilarious. But those 4 or 5 were. And it's the first time I worked with a lot of black people, so I got that kind of exposure. And anyway, it was fun. You know, that kind. And you know, I worked in the underground nighttime club scene, so that was a lot of thrills and a lot of danger.
I remember us talking years ago about the experience of being stuck.
Oh God!
Like when you're waitressing, or you know.
That was the worst thing, right?
The worst feeling.
Anyone
that
who's a waiter
scarred
knows
me
what we're
for
talking
life.
about. Waiter or waitress, you have way too much to do. You can't possibly accomplish it. And so as a result, you just almost get frozen and like, what next? What do I do?
It's like incredible. If you've never waited tables, you don't know that feeling of anxiety of being stuck.
Yes. And you can't see the end, the light at the end of the tunnel. And it could only be an hour and a half later, to come, and then you'll be fine.
I don't even know if that word is like a mainstream word. So people even know, like,
what?
When you say I'm stuck. Like,
I think only all waiters and waitresses would know it, but I don't think Main Street.
But I've had like recurring nightmares about like being stuck.
At the time, I did all the time. But now I've let it go.
Good for you. You've moved forward.
I remember once being so stuck so bad because like 3 of 4 people didn't come in that day for a lunch crowd, and it was a lunch place I worked with and you know what a lunch place means, condensed a lot of people in and out in a very short period of time.
Right.
Nothing is too complicated, and you would normally have, let's say, like 6 deuces, which are 6 tables of 2, and so I had 4 times 6, 24 tables. And it was like insane. And people were going like this, and people going like this, and people going like this. And I'm calling out, "Hold your horses!" And people are yelling at me, "I'm going to have you fired!" And it's like, "Save me, please do!" Anyway, that was a really bad experience. That I remember it 40 years, 35 years later, 40 years later.
So I'm going to backtrack a little bit because I talked about this, like the memories, when you think about memories, but so this is sort of the opposite of that. When you have goals, do you think of your goals in terms of pictures, thoughts, writing?
I think of my goals and like the happy feelings I'll have when I'm there.
So you really, what do you mean?
I'll think of being happy that I'm there. Like,
while you're working towards a goal, you'll imagine having achieved it and the emotional feeling you would have?
Yes, like I crave that emotional feeling like that I will have when I have achieved it, and I don't have to think about achieving it anymore.
Wow.
Is that weird or unusual? Or?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't think people...
Because I don't find the mechanics of getting there pleasurable. A lot of people always say, "Oh, it's the journey, it's not the destination." It's like, screw it. If it's a good destination, I want to be there and screw the journey, especially if the journey is involved stress and work and
Yeah.
you know, that kind of thing.
A lot of people think in terms of like, the words, of writing down the goal, or the picture of the goal. But for you,
Well,
the
if you're talking
emotional
about
feeling-
what's the best way to make it happen,
No,
then you have to
just-
think of those mechanics. But that's not what I.
just what? Yeah, I just wanted to know, what do you think about? So that's an interesting answer that I didn't expect. So sort of maybe along those lines. Not what regrets do you have? How do you process? Everybody has regrets. How do you process the regrets in your life that you have? What do you do with it? Do you talk about it? Do you try not to talk about it?
I don't really talk about it. I do have a very strong feeling that the things that I regret, I can't redo now at this point. It was a very time-specific things. They were very time-specific things. So there's no point in allowing myself to have negative feelings about it. Perhaps during my life, I could have thought a little bit more about them if they could have generalized to future situations. How to make better choices in the future. But I don't think it was that kind of thing, like I was making bad choices. It's just that, like, without having the knowledge of today, back then I was thinking, oh, this would be a better choice than that. As a young kid, my last year or so in high school, as an example, I could have said, I have very strong talents in math and science, as well as art. Force yourself to make these next 5 years punishing, disciplined math and science years, because then you'll have a big payoff. But I didn't realize that, because at the time all I knew is that it would take a lot of effort to pursue the math and science in an academic way during that time in my life when lots of things were happening. So I said, I want to go where there's the path of most pleasure now. Like that kind of thing. So I wish I had that little voice in my head saying, oh, it'll be worth it. You'll have 5 years you'll suffer, but then 5 years go like that and you'll be better off forever.
So the processing is just sort of occasionally talking about it, but you don't delve into it to a great degree.
No, haven't delved into it to a great degree.
So as far as the political arena, what was the political climate like in your early years?
In my early years, very early on, I became aware that our father was much more intellectually aware of things and much more intellectually gifted than the immediate other people in our adult circle, and much more progressive politically. Race issues were happening when I was first coming into consciousness in the early mid-60s. That was the big thing. The race stuff was all over television. And so as a very early on, to me, progressive became a big ideal. And conservative became associated in my mind with petty, nasty, and ignorant. And reactionary was always, to me, reactionary political views, I've always felt viscerally that was a symptom of bad moral character. And of those weaknesses intellectually.
How did that evolve?
Because it came to me that way because my father, who was an idol when you're a little kid, was progressive. And he just was very kind because he didn't rank other people out, but you could see the pain in having to talk with certain relatives, et cetera, et cetera. I have an incident that I think might be too personal because it makes someone look bad in a bad light, but I won't say. But it was like a close relative making some sort of crude joke about something political, and it just was so upsetting to him, I remember. And I remember thinking, that's just, ignorance is a bad thing. And to me, ignorance and reactionary political views became intertwined. especially because of the race stuff going on.
So did you hear a lot of political talk in the house, in the home, during your childhood
Not
years?
a lot, condensed, but potent and meaningful from my father. Mother was totally apolitical until she was around 40. And then all of a sudden she took off in the leftward direction. You know. But totally apolitical. Probably annoyingly so, would be my guess. But I didn't discuss it with her. That was not something I discussed with her. But I did, it's funny, like the discussions I did have with my father, he didn't mean this to prepare me in this way, but it armed me as a little kid that when I would go to school, I would hear teachers saying something, I'd say, that ignorant racist. You know what I mean? Or another gym teacher would say something, and I would say, boy, there's something wrong with their character. You know what I mean? Like, and it was all coming off of that. It was all a springboard from the political stuff. And to me, the political stuff was the race, civil rights, you know, that kind of stuff. You know what I mean? Directly related to that.
Do you remember a lot of the political chaos that was going on in the 60s?
I have a faint memory of the day and what was going on when Kennedy was assassinated, but I don't remember the political climate during that time, you know, what the issues were. But it was very clear that it was, you know, some maniac right-winger, you know, that would have killed him. Just like, you know, at that point when Kennedy was assassinated, everyone would talk about Lincoln. And then why was Lincoln assassinated? Some vicious Southerner who was infuriated at the ending of slavery. You see how everything would now started in my mind, started to connect to the same thread. Right-wing politics is related to racism, is related to murder, is related to bad character, is related to wanting to own people. So everything bad is related, is connected. You know what I mean?
So part of that foundation you got from things you heard him say or things he said to you?
Things he said to me and heard him say. So as I was listening.
At what age did you become aware of politics?
Intensely aware at 12, 11, 12. At 12, 13, I started to go to anti-war protests, purely initially because it was an event for fun. And someone older was willing to take me. And it was usually attached to a concert. But of course, everything seemed to immediately fall into place into my political outlook. Not that I was sophisticated about the issues. But, you know, 8 or 9 years later, I would kick myself for saying, you know, well, we were all marching around, end the war. You know, when the U.S. involvement ended in Vietnam, it didn't end it for the poor suffering people who were quote unquote on our side, who then suffered tremendous hardship as a result of our withdrawal, you know, but you're not sophisticated enough at 13. You know? So anyway, so from that time on, I won a Long Island Young Democrats award, and I went to the McGovern concert for 1972, so I was a touch older at this time. Simon and Garfunkel headlined it. It was in Madison Square Garden. It was for McGovern, and he lost in a landslide to Nixon. So by that time, I was deep into it. And after that fiasco of Nixon,
Do you remember where you were when Nixon resigned?
yes, I was at a
Did you watch it?
Crosby, Stills Nash Young concert, and Nash, I believe it
Okay.
was, announced it, and
Okay.
the place went wild. Because in those days, everyone that was young was against the war. Not like today, where you have little Alex P. Keatons running around saying vicious, racist, horrible Republican things. Every one of our generation was, you know, had solidarity in that sense. So it was a madhouse. You know, it was a wonderful moment for people. Felt like it was a wonderful moment because this was the first time in our lifetimes where a president was just so heinous on so many levels. Besides lying and cheating, he was just nasty through and through, and people hated him. He was an angel compared to Trump. An angel. You know, as our mother would say, oh, he was a bastard, but he was intelligent. He played the piano. He was cultured. Unlike this slob.
That's an ugly scene.
Ugly. I'm sorry, I hope.
No. Was there a political or world event that impacted or shaped you in some way?
I think I got a little bit of the other side of the story when there was the oil embargo in '74, and everyone had to wait for hours and hours and hours on gas lines. And I just sort of woke up to the fact that when you're an adult, practical things really matter. You can't just be idealistic and what's right in the moral universe. But if something is responsible for causing you to not be able to go to work, go grocery shopping, sitting on line for 2 hours in your car to get gas, whatever it is bad that caused this problem. And then the second event like that was in 1979 when the Iranian Revolution happened and they took over, our embassy and they kidnapped a lot of those Americans. And that also was a maturing politically in the sense that, the enemy of your enemy isn't always your friend. Because the Shah, who the Iranians were reacting against, was a bad guy. And most people on the left at that time despised the Shah. And he was a bad guy, but he wasn't hostile to the West, and he didn't kidnap our people. He was like sort of quote unquote a pawn of the West. I think the Iranian people suffered tremendously from that. I mean, women used to be able to walk around in shorts, get highly educated. You know what I mean?
Right.
And now there's a lot of repression, as a result of that particular revolution.
So that didn't affect you, but it impacted your thinking.
Yes, it matured my political thinking.
Okay. And there was something else you often talk about.
Okay. Of course, there was 1981 when the air traffic controllers went on strike. I remember this very clearly. This was pivotal in terms of just the nail in the coffin of the Republican Party, as far as I'm concerned. After that, they could never hope for anything from it. The air traffic controllers are government, federal employees, and federal employees can't strike. It's part of the law and their agreement. But there's an understanding. If you can't strike, there has to be an understanding that the entity which you can't strike against has to understand you can't strike, and so there's lines they can't cross. You know what I mean? And they have to look out for your welfare in terms of what striking would normally look out for. So the air traffic controllers had just terrible working conditions. A lot of them were dropping dead of heart attacks. They were super stressed, super long hours. It's a very stressful job, I understand. Not that I did it. But, and so they all went on strike. It was just too much for them to bear, and Reagan just immediately, well, not immediately, but after a little while, fired. And everyone in the country jumped up and down and was so happy with your average everyday Slav. And that was the end of the American economy for the middle class people, because it was the beginning of the super destruction of unions. And without collective bargaining and without power solidarity, what power do people have in terms of working, in terms of them and their employment? So at that point, eventually everyone's living, standard of living.
So you think that was sort of the beginning of that terrible...
Yeah, so that was a particular moment. When it happened, I was stunned, infuriated, and it cemented my hatred for the Republican Party. And years later, you could look back on it and say that was a very bad, starting gun, or whatever you want to call it, opening shot, or whatever the metaphor is. And
I don't think
most
many people knew what that meant.
At the time they didn't, but you know how there is a lot of, especially among reactionary Slavs, when they hear something bad happens to other people, other workers, they're like happy about it, and they don't realize everything is connected, like from the other people I would hear it from, and I wouldn't argue with them because I don't believe people can be convinced of things through rational means. I think it's all emotional and moral. We're already, once you get to be an adult and that's your reaction to that kind of situation, you're a lost soul, as far as I'm concerned. So that was
But as sort of a lucky happenstance, so that our parents were liberal and we were, imbued with these ideals, what if you were raised in a family of conservatives?
First off, our parents weren't quite liberal as much as idiosyncratic. Like, he would, father, for instance, would also see the absurdity and the the bad points of view on the other side as well. So I remember him. He would also, as a devil's advocate, argue with a lot of teenagers who would take the stock left point of view.
Okay, yeah.
Anyway, but I think it would have been destroyed my life. And, you know, I certainly wouldn't be the person I am. It's the core of me has to do with, I mean, to me, being progressive is at the core of what I am. It's like when you flip on a movie and it's a foreign movie with subtitles, a progressive person is excited. Their pupils dilated. It's a Republican person.
Wasn't always like that, though, right?
No.
Yeah.
It was before the air traffic control of things. All these characteristics were sorted in different ways. Racists were all Democrats in the 60s, the Southern racists. But then the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964, and little by little, all those Southern Democrat racists switched to the Republican Party, and all the voters switched to the Republican Party. See what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So then racism all moved into one political party. You know what I mean? And then anti-union moved into one political party. And then wanting to control women's right to control their own reproductive destiny moved into one political party.
So when you say sorted, you mean these values and ideals were mixed between the two parties?
Yes. A lot of this stuff had nothing to do with political parties in those days. Like whether or not you believed women shouldn't have a right to control their own reproductive destiny. That wasn't a Republican or a Democratic thing until Ronald Reagan, when it just, you know what I mean? That's when it was cemented during the Reagan years.
Why did he have that?
In the 70s, it began full throttle. There was a woman named Phyllis Schlafly, was this horrible, educated lawyer who, big thing in life is women shouldn't be educated, they should be housewives, that the Equal Rights Amendment will destroy their lives. And she formed a campaign against the Equal Rights Amendment, and that campaign was successful. And that was, I don't know, early 73-ish or so that got rolling. So that was when all wanting to control women, misogyny, all sorted into the Republican Party. Before then, it was randomly distributed among political parties.
How did that happen because of her?
Well, she was just the spearhead of that particular movement, Stop the ERA, and she was very influential in that sense. But there were many people. She didn't convince people to be against the ERA. There were many people who hate women, who think women are secondary, who claim, "Oh, we love women in their place." They shouldn't get to decide what their place is. We should. Anyway, so before 73, it was not a Democratic thing to be in favor of women's rights and a Republican thing to be against them.
Okay.
That's when it changed. And that was also the year of Roe v. Wade, I believe, 73. Don't quote me, could be 72 or 74. No, it had to be 73 or earlier. Could even be 70. But Roe v. Wade also happened at that period of time, and that infuriated, fundamentalist Christians, who then immediately went 100% to the
So
Republican Party.
was it Roe v. Wade really that
was
one of the
in my mind, that
factors?
wasn't super big when I was a kid, but that was definitely one of the big factors that helped. That had a lot to do with
created this opposition
self-sorting.
in the parties because
The sorting of all the, like a menu where everyone who believes this is a Republican, everyone who believes this is a Republican, everyone who believes this is a Republican. And so what I say is that everything bad became Republican, everything good became.
How do you think that changed politics and then the world?
It gave the Republicans a tremendous advantage, because when you're bad and all you want is for yourself, power, influence, money, you're willing to do anything. And so for 30 years, Democrats have bended over backwards to not be hypocrites, although everyone is to an extent, to not be liars, although everyone lies to an extent, but everyone doesn't have it as a policy. It isn't their number one go-to. So Democrats bent over backwards because they believed in good things. They believed in other people have a valid point of view. Democrats believe, walking in other people's shoes. This is a tremendous advantage when you're in a gunfight and you only bring a knife. So it helped the Republicans score many, many victories, which includes stacking the Supreme Court with foul and reprehensible right-wing fanatics. Foul and reprehensible right-wing fanatics. Now 5 of them against 4. And there's one or two on some social issues that try to toss a bone because they're desperate for people to love them, like John Roberts. We know who he is. We know he's not a good guy. But he will always vote in terms of corporate rights against individual rights. Always. When it comes to like health care, he might say, "Oh, let them keep their crust." Or women's rights, let them, let them wear pants if they want. You know what I mean? We'll get some other. We'll cover you some other way.
So, flying all the way to the
Okay.
present. So Kamala Harris, the left wing especially youth, is against her because of her role as a prosecutor.
This is very interesting.
So, what's your perspective on that?
Okay. It's such a broader issue, the fact that the left youth is against her. Because the left youth, the viewpoints of the left youth now represent, for the first time, swinging back of the pendulum with a lot of crazy, inflexible ideas popping up on the left as well. In other words, the belief in purity, that you have to be really great at everything, otherwise you shouldn't even exist. So, I felt that way too because I always found prosecutors distasteful, because prosecutors in this country have way too much power. They get to determine who goes to jail and who doesn't, by making it so distasteful for innocent people that they plea bargain to things they didn't even do, et cetera, et cetera. But she wasn't, as far as prosecutors go, she wasn't that horrible. And a lot of the stories you hear, it's like hard to nail down, like she wouldn't allow someone's DNA to exonerate them, and this and that. And a lot of public...
That sounds pretty horrible.
That sounds horrible, but I couldn't nail down that story as accurate and true.
Okay.
And then some public defenders came forward to say about all the prosecutors I worked with, she was the best in terms of defendants' rights. And in many ways, she's very, very progressive. So, my point about her is I'm really happy. It had to be a woman of color. He promised a woman, had to be a woman of color. And the fact that she's more progressive than people view her as, good. Because there are lots of moderates that we need to vote to who were afraid, they were paranoid of an Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez type. I love her. I love AOC. But a lot of people are paranoid, think she's radical left. I don't. But that's my view of Kamala Harris. And I don't think that people who are holding her to such an incredible standard, I think they better lighten up. We have someone who literally will kill your children if you could pinch a nickel out of it in the White House. Give me a break. Give me a break, people. Grow up. They don't view that. If Trump gets one more person on the Supreme Court, everything with their climate change they're screaming about, you can't have it. Not if we have 6 people on the Supreme Court. If he gets one more Supreme Court justice, there is no more women's right to choose. You can just kiss everything you care about that you're screaming about. Medicare for all, you can't have that if you have another conservative on the Supreme Court. Every time a Republican brings a case to the Supreme Court, they'll rule against the Medicare for all. So all the things you say people have to be for you to vote for them, you can't have any of them if a Republican wins the White House this November. Not just ever. This November, make or break everything you care about. It's the way I view it.
Have we ever been this vulnerable?
And the pendulum would naturally swing back, we'll all be dead by then. I mean, climate change will be irreversible if we wait the normal 40 years for the Supreme Court to wash out. We need Democrats to be like Republicans. When a Democrat gets elected, they need to say, guess what? Nothing in the Constitution says we need to have 9 Supreme Court justices. We're having 11. I'm appointing 3 radical, female, progressives on the Supreme Court. When the Republicans start squawking, we cut their rights. That's it. We're doing it. I mean, that's what Democrats have to do. And you have to stop doing this hand-wringing. Oh, is it right? Screw it's right. The humanity needs to be saved.
This is bringing me back to Dad, who sort of gave me the idea as a kid that revenge was a bad thing and using might was a bad tactic.
Mm-hmm.
And you should.
I think that's something he was wrong about, not the revenge thing. He was right about the revenge, even though it runs strong in me from my mama's side. A river runs right through me. but I can recognize it's bad. But if you have a boat full of children and everyone's drowning, and someone's throwing rocks at you, you might have to shoot them. You know what I mean? It's like the other side is trying to kill you. You might have to kill them
Could
back.
he have made that decision?
What?
Could he have made that decision?
I think that was one of his flaws, that he could never have been cutthroat, even in circumstances where being cutthroat was the only way. That old, that common experiment when there's like one person on this track, one person on this track, and the train is heading towards not one person on this track, 5 people on this track. You could pull the switch and divert the train onto the track so it'll go and only kill that one person. But it will take an act on your part to make it happen. So you will be responsible for killing that one person. Would you do it? Now, if it was only that 4 people and that one person, I might not be able to do it. But if on this side was all of humanity was going to die from climate change, and on that side it was Republicans who were going to be screaming, "Woo, Democrats are unfair," you bet I could send the train their way. Do you know what I'm saying?
So you couldn't, for the 5 to 1, you don't.
I don't know if I could.
Yeah.
Maybe I could, maybe I couldn't.
It seems like
but that's the principle.
It seems like an easy choice, but
until you're there and
right.
You're saying the 5 people wouldn't die because of anything you did. It's circumstances. You'd have to make a conscious decision to kill that person.
Questions now seem redundant because we've covered things. So one of my things that I was going to ask you is, of all the things that you learned from your parents, what do you think was the most valuable? And you probably covered this.
What we mentioned, and I don't think lessons they intentionally taught. I think the lessons I got about appreciating the other side of the mirror, I like to say. Remember that book as a kid we all loved, Through the Looking Glass? But it's like, that's the way I thought life with our parents was. It's like, they led us to a spot by the way they were, that we were capable of seeing life from the other side of the mirror. I think that's the most valuable lesson that I learned, and the valuable lesson being to appreciate that, because I feel like I have a secret advantage. Both incredibly original thinkers and creative and original people, different than the regular milieu, like that they came from. Can you imagine? Think of where they came from and who they were.
Is that a curse or is that a
combination?
Being original is not so great.
No, but
in terms of basic life happiness in the end.
No, not for happiness or success. Oh my Lord, no. The worst thing for success in terms of getting along at jobs and making a lot of money. The worst. But the value it adds to your life and your brain, your cerebral life.
So happiness has no value then?
That kind of happiness has maybe is a little overrated. It has value. But maybe cerebral happiness, which is like a rush of understanding and appreciation, is so much more valuable when you're in balance. It's my point of view. If I had to characterize I'm not going to go on and on, but if I had to characterize my childhood, I would be a little bit embarrassed because it would sound a little Pollyanna-ish, because I think of it mostly in a positive light, especially when I just think in terms of the siblings. A lot of poignancy too, sadness, but that's mostly related to parent stuff. But and I feel like maybe I'm deluding myself a little bit. People that think their childhood were so happy usually are a little deluded. But it's not like I was unaware of like some of the frightening stuff or the foreboding stuff or the money problems or this or that. But I was hyper aware of the idyllic sense of like skipping through fields, like life is sweet, like staying up late at night and seeing headlights through the Venetian blinds and like giggling, and when some adult is yelling, "Go to sleep," you know what I mean? And like getting over not going to sleep. And, to me that was all, and that was because of the group dynamic. You don't get that as much alone. You felt like you had partners in crime.
So, I guess we're going to end then.
Thank you. It was fun.
Okay.